Silence is often misunderstood. In international politics, the loudest voices are frequently mistaken for the strongest ones. Nations that speak quickly, threaten openly, and react instantly are seen as decisive, while those that pause are labeled hesitant or weak. For decades, this perception has followed the United States. Again and again, critics and rivals have pointed to moments of American restraint as proof of decline. They see political debate, delayed responses, and internal disagreement as signs that the country has lost its edge. From the outside, it appears chaotic. A democracy arguing with itself in public. Institutions slowing decisions. Leaders constrained by law, media, and public opinion. To authoritarian systems, this looks like dysfunction. To centralized powers, it looks inefficient. And to rivals looking for opportunity, it looks like an opening. But this interpretation ignores a fundamental aspect of how American power actually works. Silence in the U.S. system is rarely an activity. It is often a phase. While speeches dominate headlines and political conflict fills the news cycle, other processes move quietly beneath the surface. Intelligence agencies analyze patterns, not headlines. Military planners simulate outcomes years in advance. Economic institutions adjust pressure points gradually, without announcements. Alliances are consulted, reinforced, and aligned behind closed doors. Unlike regimes that rely on speed and spectacle, the American system relies on accumulation. Decisions are rarely impulsive. They are layered. Legal authority is secured. Public justification is prepared. Logistics are positioned long before action becomes visible. This creates a dangerous illusion for those watching from the outside. They mistake patience for fear. They confuse delay with indecision. And they assume that if nothing is happening publicly, nothing is happening at all. History repeatedly shows the opposite. Some of the most consequential American actions were preceded by long periods of apparent restraint. Moments when critics openly mocked hesitation, when rivals tested boundaries, confident that no response would come. What they failed to see was that the response was not absent. It was forming. The United States does not always react immediately because it does not need to. Time, for America, is often an advantage. Every delay allows for broader consensus, deeper preparation, and greater leverage. By the time action becomes visible, the conditions have usually already been shaped. This is the paradox of American power. It is loud internally and quiet externally, messy on the surface, methodical underneath. Those who judge it only by what they see in the moment almost always misjudge it entirely. The mistake many rivals make is assuming that power must always announce itself. They expect strength to be immediate, visible, and unmistakable, when it is no longer this. This assumption comes from systems where authority is centralized and action is direct. In those systems, decisions are made quickly because they face little resistance. Debate is minimal. Dissent is controlled. Power moves in straight lines. The American system does not. In the United States, power moves through layers. Congress debates. Courts interpret. Agencies adjust. Public opinion reacts. Media amplifies conflict. From the outside, this looks like delay. From the inside, it functions as filtration. Bad ideas face resistance early. Extreme responses are slowed. Long-term consequences are examined before irreversible steps are taken. This process frustrates those who equate speed with effectiveness, but it protects the system from catastrophic error. Rivals often misread this friction as paralysis. They assume that if decisions are not immediate, they are not coming. This belief has repeatedly led to strategic miscalculations. What they fail to understand is that American decision-making does not stop under pressure. It reorganizes. While public institutions argue openly, parallel systems continue to function quietly. Military readiness does not pause because politicians disagree. Economic pressure does not disappear because debates continue. Intelligence gathering does not wait for consensus to form. Instead of a single command chain, the United States operates through redundancy. Multiple institutions pursue overlapping objectives. If one path slows, another advances. If one approach fails, alternatives already exist. This redundancy is often criticized as inefficiency. In reality, it is resilience stock car. Centralized systems can appear powerful because they act quickly. But when they choose incorrectly, there are few internal mechanisms to correct course. Errors compound. Silence hides damage until it becomes impossible to manage. The American system exposes its conflict early. Mistakes are debated publicly. Weak strategies are challenged before they are fully implemented. This visibility creates embarrassment, but it also prevents irreversible failure. Rivals who mistake this transparency for weakness often move too soon. They press boundaries before preparations are complete. They assume hesitation where calculation exists. By the time they realize that pressure has triggered coordination rather than collapse, the window they thought they had is already closing. What looks like delay is often the final stage before alignment. And Allen, once achieved, moves with far more force than impulsive action ever could. Another common error is assuming that America's internal conflict weakens its external position. Political polarization, public disagreement, and cultural division are often cited as evidence that the country cannot act cohesively on the world stage. Two rivals, a nation arguing with itself, appears distracted and vulnerable. This perception ignores how conflict functions inside the American system. Disagreement is not a breakdown of authority. It is a mechanism for stress, testing decisions before they are enforced. In many systems, unity is achieved through suppression. Dissent is removed to preserve the appearance of control. But suppressed conflict does not disappear. It accumulates. When it finally surfaces, it does so explosively. The United States operates in reverse. Conflict is allowed to surface immediately. Arguments are public. Opposition is institutionalized. Pressure is released continuously rather than stored. This process is uncomfortable and often chaotic, but it prevents sudden collapse. By the time a decision is implemented, It has already survived legal challenge, political resistance, media scrutiny, and public debate. What remains is not perfect, but it is durable. Rivals watching from the outside focus on the noise. They mistake volume for instability. They see protests, elections, and partisan rhetoric and assume that national focus has been lost. What they fail to notice is that core strategic interests rarely change. Administrations shift. Rhetoric evolves. But underlying commitments remain remarkably consistent. Defense alliances persist across political cycles. Trade routes remain protected. Financial systems continue to operate with global influence. Long-term military planning extends far beyond any single election. This continuity exists precisely because conflict is visible. Power is not tied to one leader or one party. It is distributed across institutions that outlast political moments. When pressure increases externally, internal conflict does not automatically intensify. In many cases, it narrows. Differences that dominate domestic politics fade when core interests are challenged. History shows that periods of intense, internal debate have not prevented the United States from acting decisively abroad. In some cases, they have short response. Rivals who assume that division equals distraction often underestimate how quickly American institutions can converge once a strategic line is crossed. By the time unity becomes visible, preparation has usually already occurred. Another reason America's silence is misinterpreted lies in how it approaches time. Many powers think in terms of immediate reactions and short political cycles. They measure success by how quickly a response is delivered and how visibly it is displayed. The United States has historically treated time as a strategic asset. Delay is not always avoidance. In many cases, waiting allows information to accumulate. It exposes the intentions of rivals. It forces opponents to reveal their priorities, limitations, and internal pressures. Every move they make while America appears inactive adds data to the calculation. This patience often frustrates adversaries. They interpret restraint as uncertainty and escalate, believing they are gaining advantage. In reality, they are clarifying the situation for American planners. While rivals rush to act, the United States often uses that movement against them. Supply lines are mapped. Economic dependencies are identified. Diplomatic alignments are tested. Technological capabilities are assessed under real-world conditions. By the time a response becomes visible, it is rarely improvised. Options have been simulated. Costs have been measured. Second and third-order consequences have been considered. This approach stands in contrast to systems that rely on rapid, centralized decisions. Speed creates the appearance of strength, but it also reduces flexibility. Once a move is made, reversing it becomes politically dangerous. American restraint preserves optionality. It allows multiple paths to remain open until the most advantageous one becomes clear. When action finally comes, it is not rushed, it is optimized. History shows that many of America's most effective responses came after long periods of apparent inaction, moments when rivals grew confident, overextended, or expose themselves by acting too soon. The silence was never emptiness. It was observation. By misreading this patience, adversaries often create the very conditions that limit their own choices. When the United States finally moves, it does so with clarity and with fewer constraints than those who acted first. A further misunderstanding comes from how American power is distributed. Rivals often expect strength to be centralized, visible, and directed from a single authority. When they fail to identify a clear command or an immediate directive, they assume coordination is weak or non-existent. The reality is the opposite. American power is intentionally decentralized. It is spread across institutions, industries, alliances, and private actors that operate independently but align under pressure. This structure makes American action difficult to predict. There is no single switch to flip, no single order that reveals intent. Movement happens in layers, often without public coordination. While governments debate publicly, corporations adjust supply chains. Financial institutions reposition capital. Research centers accelerate development. Military planners revise posture without announcements. To an external observer, these shifts appear disconnected. In practice, they converge. Decentralization allows momentum to build without signaling escalation. Pressure accumulates quietly until alignment occurs. When it does, the response appears sudden, not because it was rushed, but because it was prepared in parallel. This model also reduces vulnerability. Centralized systems depend on a small number of decision-makers and choke points. If those are disrupted, action collapses. The American system has redundancy built into it. If one pathway slows, another continues. If one institution stalls, others compensate. This redundancy is often criticized as inefficiency. In reality, it is survivability. Rivals who search for a single moment of decision often miss the broader movement. By the time they recognize coordination, the process is already irreversible. This is why American responses can feel disproportionate. They appear to emerge fully formed. What was invisible becomes undeniable almost overnight. The silence that preceded it was not absence. It was distribution. And distribution, once aligned, produces a level of momentum that centralized systems struggle to match or contain. Another factor that leads to miscalculation is how America integrates its allies into this period of silence. Rivals often assume that the absence of public coordination means the United States is acting alone, or worse, that it lacks support. In reality, silence is frequently the phase in which alignment happens. Alliances are not activated through speeches or headlines. They are reinforced through private consultations, shared intelligence, joint planning, and quiet reassurance. Positions are clarified behind closed doors long before they are announced publicly. This creates a false sense of isolation for those watching from the outside. They see no formal statements, no visible coalitions, and no immediate mobilization. They assume partners are hesitant or divided. But alliances do not require constant visibility to function. Trust is built long before crisis emerges. Agreements already exist. Interoperability is already tested. Commitments are understood without needing to be repeated publicly. During periods of apparent American restraint, allied nations often adjust in parallel. They prepare infrastructure. They align policies. They position resources quietly without drawing attention. This coordination is deliberately subtle. Public declarations invite countermeasures. Silence preserves flexibility. By the time cooperation becomes visible, it is no longer fragile. It is operational. Rivals frequently underestimate this networked strength because they focus on individual actors. They measure power in isolation rather than in aggregation. The American system rarely acts as a single entity. It acts as a hub. When pressure increases, the network responds collectively, even if the response appears to originate from one point. This is why moments of American action often feel overwhelming. They are not the product of a single decision, but of synchronized movement across multiple systems. What seemed like hesitation was coordination. What looked like silence was alignment. By the time rivals realize that they are no longer dealing with one nation, but with an integrated system, the strategic landscape has already shifted. A final and often fatal error is assuming that American silence reflects a lack of will. Rivals interpret restraint as uncertainty, believing that domestic debate has eroded the resolve to act decisively. This assumption misunderstands how resolve is formed in the United States. Willpower is not declared. It is built. Public disagreement does not eliminate commitment. It concentrates it. When action finally occurs, it carries the weight of institutions, allies, and public justification. In centralized systems, resolve is immediate but fragile. It depends on a narrow circle of authority. If conditions change or pressure increases, commitment can fracture quickly. American resolve develops through resistance. Each challenge strengthens justification. Each delay tests patience. By the time a line is crossed, backing down becomes unlikely. This is why American responses often appear irreversible once they begin. They are the result of cumulative pressure, not impulse. Rivals who misread silence as weakness often push too far. They escalate incrementally, believing they are probing limits. In reality, they are reinforcing the case for action. When the response comes, it is not framed as aggression, but as necessity, not as choice but negation. At that point, internal debate narrows. Institutions align. Public support consolidates. The silence that preceded action becomes irrelevant. What matters is momentum. History shows that America rarely acts at the moment others expect. It acts at the moment it cannot afford not to. Those who confuse patience with indecision often discover too late that the silence was never hesitation. It was resolve forming under pressure. Another reason America's silence is so often misread is because its power rarely announces itself emotionally. Rivals expect outrage, threats, or dramatic warnings before action. When those signals do not appear, they assume the situation is not serious. But American strategy has never relied on emotional escalation. It relies on normalization. Instead of declaring emergencies, the system absorbs pressure as routine. Markets adjust quietly. Budgets are reallocated incrementally. Military posture shifts are framed as exercises or maintenance. Nothing appears urgent until everything is already in place. This creates a psychological trap for adversaries. They are conditioned to respond to visible alarm. When alarm does not come, they relax, delay. They assume they still control the tempo. Meanwhile, the United States continues to integrate pressure into existing systems rather than reacting to it as a crisis. This makes preparation harder to detect. There is no single moment to point to and say, "This is when it began." By the time rivals recognize a change in posture, the adjustment has already become standard operating procedure. What looked temporary is permanent. What looked symbolic is structural. This method denies opponents a clear trigger point. They cannot easily justify escalation because nothing dramatic has occurred. They cannot mobilize public opinion against a threat that has not been openly declared. American silence also limits escalation pathways. By avoiding theatrical responses, it prevents rivals from claiming provocation. Pressure is applied without providing a narrative that justifies retaliation. This is why American action often feels asymmetric. It does not match the tone of the challenge. It reshapes the environment instead. Trade routes shift. Technology access changes. Financial pressure accumulates. Operational freedom narrows quietly. By the time rivals realize they are operating in a different strategic environment, reversing course becomes costly. They face constraints they did not plan for and pressures they did not anticipate. The silence was not indecision. It was normalization of advantage. And once advantage becomes normal, it no longer needs to be announced. Silence, in the end, is not the absence of power. It is often its most refined expression. Across history, the United States has been repeatedly judged by the wrong signals. Observers looked for urgency and found patience. They expected emotion and saw restraint. They waited for declarations and missed preparation. What they failed to recognize was that American power rarely reveals itself at the beginning of a confrontation. It reveals itself at the point of inevitability. By the time action becomes visible, the debate has already narrowed. Institutions have aligned. Allies are prepared. Economic and military conditions have been shaped quietly in advance. This is why American responses often feel sudden to outsiders. They appear to arrive fully formed, without warning. In reality, they are the final step of a process that unfolded silently over time. Rivals who misread restraint as weakness often contribute to their own disadvantage. They escalate prematurely. They expose dependencies. They commit resources before understanding the full environment. The silence gives them room to move and space to make mistakes. Once those mistakes are clear, the response becomes less about reaction and more about correction. Not punishment, but rebalancing. Not spectacle, but control. This pattern has repeated across different eras. different rivals, and different forms of conflict. The details change. The structure remains. American power does not rely on appearing dominant at every moment. It relies on shaping outcomes over time. That is why judging it by surface-level noise leads to consistent miscalculation. The arguments, the delays, the visible conflict, these are not signs of decay. They are the outer layer of a system designed to absorb pressure without breaking. Silence, in this context, is not hesitation. It is confidence in process. And for those who mistake that confidence for weakness, the realization usually comes too late. Not when America speaks, but when the environment has already changed around them